prison system in many countries is often touted as a place for rehabilitation and justice, but beneath the surface lies a dark reality of corruption and exploitation that preys on the most vulnerable. In some nations, prisons have become profit-driven enterprises where inmates are treated not as human beings deserving of a second chance, but as commodities to be exploited for financial gain. Private prisons, in particular, have been at the center of numerous scandals, with corporations cutting corners on basic necessities like food, healthcare, and sanitation to maximize profits. These facilities often operate under contracts that guarantee high occupancy rates, creating perverse incentives to incarcerate more people, often for minor offenses, to keep the cells filled and the money flowing. The result is a system that prioritizes profit over rehabilitation, leaving inmates trapped in a cycle of neglect and abuse. In many corrupt prison systems, inmates are subjected to inhumane living conditions that violate basic human rights. Overcrowding is a pervasive issue, with cells designed for one person often housing 3 or 4 inmates, leading to unsanitary environments and the rapid spread of diseases. Basic necessities like clean water, nutritious food, and medical care are frequently withheld or provided in insufficient quantities, leaving inmates to suffer from malnutrition, untreated illnesses, and preventable deaths. In some cases, guards and prison officials exploit their power by demanding bribes from inmates in exchange for basic services, such as access to medical treatment or even a mattress to sleep on. This systemic neglect and exploitation create an environment where survival becomes a daily struggle, and the concept of rehabilitation is rendered meaningless. The exploitation of inmate labor is another glaring issue in corrupt prison systems. In many countries, prisoners are forced to work for little to no pay, often in hazardous conditions, while private companies and governments profit from their labor. This modern-day form of slavery is justified under the guise of rehabilitation or skill building, but in reality, it is a means of extracting cheap labor from a captive population. In some cases, inmates are forced to work in industries that directly benefit the prison system or its corporate partners, such as manufacturing, agriculture, or call centers, with no regard for their well-being or future prospects. The profits generated from this labor rarely benefit the inmates themselves, who are often left with no savings or job prospects upon release, perpetuating the cycle of poverty and incarceration. Corruption within prison systems often extends to the highest levels of government, with officials turning a blind eye to abuses or actively participating in them. In some countries, prison officials collude with criminal organizations to maintain control over inmates, allowing drugs, weapons, and other contraband to flow freely in exchange for bribes or a share of the profits. This collusion not only undermines the rule of law, but also creates a dangerous environment where violence and exploitation are rampant. Inmates who refuse to comply with these corrupt practices often face retaliation, including physical abuse, solitary confinement, or even death. The lack of accountability and transparency in these systems makes it nearly impossible for inmates to seek justice or for external oversight to address the rampant corruption. The psychological toll of being trapped in a corrupt prison system is immense, with many inmates suffering from severe mental health issues as a result of their experiences. The constant fear of violence, the lack of access to mental health services, and the dehumanizing treatment by guards and officials contribute to high rates of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder among inmates. In some cases, the trauma experienced in prison can be more damaging than the original sentence, leaving inmates ill-equipped to reintegrate into society upon release. The lack of support for mental health within these systems is not just a failure of compassion but a deliberate strategy to maintain control over the inmate population, as those who are mentally broken are less likely to resist or demand change. The exploitation of inmates extends beyond physical labor and living conditions to include the manipulation of their legal rights. In many corrupt prison systems, inmates are denied access to adequate legal representation, making it nearly impossible for them to appeal their sentences or challenge abuses within the system. Prison officials often delay or withhold legal documents, charge exorbitant fees for access to legal resources, or intimidate inmates into dropping their cases. This denial of justice ensures that inmates remain powerless and voiceless, unable to challenge the system that exploits them. In some cases, inmates are even coerced into confessing to crimes they did not commit or accepting plea deals that extend their sentences. all to maintain the status quo and keep the prison population high. The role of private companies in perpetuating corrupt prison systems cannot be overstated. Private prisons, which operate on a for-profit model, have a vested interest in maintaining high incarceration rates, as their profits depend on the number of inmates they house. This has led to widespread lobbying efforts by private prison companies to influence legislation and policies that increase incarceration, such as mandatory minimum sentences and harsh penalties for non-violent offenses. These companies often cut costs by understaffing their facilities, providing substandard care, and ignoring the rights of inmates, all in the name of maximizing profits. The result is a system that prioritizes financial gain over human dignity, with inmates paying the price for corporate greed. The exploitation of inmates is not limited to private prisons. Even publicly run facilities are often rife with corruption and abuse. In some countries, prison officials use their positions of power to extort money from inmates and their families, demanding bribes for everything from better living conditions to early release. Inmates who cannot pay are often subjected to harsher treatment, including physical abuse, solitary confinement, or denial of basic necessities. This culture of corruption creates a hierarchy within the prison system, where those with money or connections can buy their way to better treatment, while the poorest and most vulnerable inmates are left to suffer. The impact of corrupt prison systems extends far beyond the walls of the facilities themselves, affecting entire communities and perpetuating cycles of poverty and crime. When inmates are released from these systems, they often return to society with no resources, no job prospects, and the stigma of having been incarcerated. This makes it nearly impossible for them to reintegrate into their communities, leading to high rates of recidivism. The cycle of incarceration and release becomes a revolving door, with the same individuals repeatedly returning to prison, often for minor offenses. This not only devastates the lives of the individuals involved, but also places a heavy burden on society as a whole, as resources are diverted to maintain a broken system rather than addressing the root causes of crime. The lack of oversight and accountability in corrupt prison systems allows abuses to continue unchecked. In many countries, there is no independent body to monitor prison conditions or investigate allegations of abuse, leaving inmates with no recourse when their rights are violated. Even when abuses are reported, they are often ignored or covered up by prison officials, who face no consequences for their actions. This culture of impunity emboldens those in power to continue exploiting inmates, knowing that they are unlikely to face any repercussions. The absence of transparency and accountability in these systems is a fundamental flaw that perpetuates corruption and abuse. The exploitation of inmates is often exacerbated by systemic inequalities that disproportionately affect marginalized communities. In many countries, people of color, low-income individuals, and other vulnerable groups are more likely to be incarcerated and subjected to harsh treatment within the prison system. This is not a coincidence, but a reflection of broader societal inequalities that are replicated and amplified within the prison system. The over-policing of marginalized communities, racial bias in sentencing, and the criminalization of poverty all contribute to the overrepresentation of these groups in corrupt prison systems. Once incarcerated, they are more likely to be exploited and abused, further entrenching the cycles of inequality and injustice. The use of solitary confinement as a tool of control and punishment is another hallmark of corrupt prison systems. Inmates placed in solitary confinement are often isolated for 23 hours a day in small, windowless cells, with little to no human contact or access to mental health services. This practice, which has been widely condemned by human rights organizations, can have devastating effects on an individual's mental health, leading to hallucinations, paranoia, and even suicidal thoughts. In corrupt prison systems, solitary confinement is often used arbitrarily as a form of punishment or retaliation, with inmates subjected to prolonged periods of isolation for minor infractions or simply for speaking out against abuses. The psychological damage inflicted by solitary confinement can last long after an inmate is released, making it even more difficult for them to reintegrate into society. The exploitation of inmates is not just a domestic issue but a global one, with corrupt prison systems existing in countries around the world. In some nations, political dissidents and activists are targeted for imprisonment as a means of silencing opposition and maintaining authoritarian control. These individuals are often subjected to particularly harsh treatment, including torture, forced labor, and denial of basic rights, as a way of breaking their spirits and deterring others from speaking out. The use of prisons as tools of political repression is a stark reminder of the ways in which corrupt systems can be weaponized to maintain power and control. The role of international organizations and human rights groups in exposing and combating corrupt prison systems is crucial, but their efforts are often met with resistance from governments and prison officials. In many cases, these organizations are denied access to prisons or are only allowed to visit under strict supervision, making it difficult to gather accurate information about conditions inside. Even when abuses are documented, governments often dismiss the findings or retaliate against those who speak out, including inmates, activists, and journalists. This lack of cooperation and transparency makes it challenging to hold corrupt prison systems accountable and to push for meaningful reform. The exploitation of inmates is not just a moral issue but an economic one, with corrupt prison systems draining resources that could be better spent on education, healthcare, and other social services. The high cost of maintaining these systems, combined with the economic burden of recidivism, places a heavy strain on national budgets and diverts resources away from programs that could address the root causes of crime. In countries where corruption is rampant, the funds allocated to prisons are often embezzled or misused, further exacerbating the problem.